All right. Thank you so much for being here, especially since the weather is not really great. That's one way to summarize it. Um, what I'm going to start with is give you a sense of where this book emerged from. Why did I even think writing a book makes sense to talk about the issues of Adivasi or indigenous struggles in India? And as a lawyer working with these communities, over the course of 10 years, it made the most sense to culminate it with a book. And so I'm going to speak a bit to the process and how it kind of got started. After which I'm going to do a short reading from the book. And then I get to have a conversation with Charanya here, who has also worked with Adivasi communities in the state of Telangana, but I'm sure she would speak much more to the work that she has done. But what brings us together in some sense is a particular piece of legislation called the Forest Rights Act. And I'll speak a bit more to that as well as I talk about the book. So why a book, right? A lawyer working with Adivasi communities, why would you think about narrating those stories and thinking about writing a book? So what I started to do quite early on in my lawyering was I maintained a journal. Only because practicing law in these contexts became really, really difficult. And eventually what worked was the fact that there was this legislation called the Forest Rights Act. So the Forest Rights Act undid that colonial piece of legislation called the Indian Forest Act, which criminalized the right to grazing. And it allowed for these rights not only to be recognized, but for it to become an integral part of the process of conserving these forest areas, which was really, really huge. And so that was the context in which I was lawyering, and it was impossible not to write about these stories. And these anecdotes, of course, as much as they're interesting, and as much as they're part of the lived realities of these communities, to me the intriguing question was, as a lawyer, how does one adequately represent the interests of the ecosystem alongside the interests of the community? And that sort of is a thread that runs throughout this book. The other aspect that I focus on a lot in this book is how the state is an authoritarian state, right? We always encounter the term authoritarianism or the authoritarian state when we talk about democracy, constitutionalism, the current times that we're living in. But I always think that the earth has been the laboratory and the basis on which authoritarianism has cemented and solidified itself. And so I chronicle that story from the colonial encounter in India's forests all the way to the making of the current Indian state. And the reason I say it's authoritarian is because at the end of the day, the state wants to have complete control over the resources, right? Whether it is the subsoil resources in the form of coal, bauxite, or iron, or in the form of surface level resources when it comes to timber. And interestingly, that entire authoritarian makeup of the state comes under the guise of conservation, right? The idea is that we conserve forest areas, but it's conservation with the potential to extract. Who has the right to extract? And so I try and trace those two legal arcs within the book, and then talk about indigenous legal struggles acknowledging that particular framework. And as a young lawyer, I think you learn a lot about the multiple avatars or sort of faces of the state when you're in these contexts. Because not only is the state authoritarian, but it has multiple forms. So it's the police state. Sometimes it's the state that extracts. Sometimes it's the state that comes in for just welfare schemes. So you see the multiple versions of the state, and I think that what I talk about in my book is how the law configures that and shapes that. But I think as lawyers, one of the central questions we sit with is, as much as we critique the law as a force both for extraction and rights erasure, it's also a force for empowerment, right? As lawyers, how much will you use the law to resist? How much will you use the law to sort of give it and comply? So another thread that you find in the book is about how do I mediate those struggles, right? Should I reimagine the law, or should I use the law in a way that recrafts or reframes these legal struggles? So that's basically a sort of summary of the book. What I'm going to do now is just a quick reading of the preface because it kind of speaks a bit to some of the themes that I spoke to, as well as sort of, it kind of draws a lot from my journal of like environmental lawyering. Reflections on environmental lawyering. Who is an environmental lawyer in India? This was a question I carried up my sleeve, in the depths of my pocket, in the hidden crevices of my anxious mind as a young law student. Was it even possible, I wondered, to be an environmental lawyer? Growing up in a middle-class household, there was subtle pressure to be profitable, get a professional degree and become a part of a big law firm. I internalized the thought that a career in environmental law could only be a passion, but not a mainstay occupation. As many made it their business to remind me that I would be paid in nuts and berries only. The sole environmental lawyer I had seen in the flesh was Ritwik Datta at a summer school that I had attended. It was a breath of fresh air and full of promise. Here he was with sharp observations, shiny shoes, and a sustainable career. That was sort of the inspiring moment for me to really sort of excavate whether I could technically even think about lawyering for the environment and communities. During my first visit to an Adivasi area in the municipality of Gadgaon in Maharashtra in 2008, I was deeply concerned by the ramifications of the construction of the Sardar Sarovar Dam for the land and the local community because they were both dispossessed. I met with the members of the social movement working against this destructive development project called the Narmada Bachao Andolan, or Save the Narmada campaign. It was then that I realized that environmental law was a part of the everyday reality of forest-dwelling communities, determining their access to resources, livelihood, and prompting strategies of how can they even safeguard their lands. This was when I decided that it was time for me to work closely with these communities as a lawyer. So in some sense, making that decision that I need to lawyer for the communities and the ecosystem. And they were in need of legal aid. And many of them were actually equipped with the most creative interpretations of the law. So that was another huge learning. I think as lawyers, we tend to go into these spaces saying that I have the clever legal strategy. But once you know that it frames the everyday reality of these peoples, you have to take a step back. Because I think they know the law much better than I ever would. So in some sense, I had to relearn outside of my school. In 2012, I joined Natural Justice, a team of environmental lawyers who were based in South Africa, but were looking to set up an office in India. The organization was founded on the premise of a legal instrument called Biocultural Community Protocol. So this was like a legal innovation they came up with, where they said that communities should be able to articulate the law on their own terms, and that will become the basis on which they should have conversations. But many attempts by Natural Justice to introduce BCPs into local communities in India were led by forest-dwelling communities and non-profits working on forest rights as an imposition of a foreign legal approach on Indian soil. Especially since the Forest Rights Act existed. Why are we reinventing the wheel? As a young lawyer and a woman in the New Delhi, I did not have the strength to voice my thinking on the matter. That the cultural rights of forest-dwelling communities in India had evolved over time, and these communities were astonishingly diverse. So a single document would be rather inadequate to represent the interests of these people and their lands. And so I wanted to stop with that, just to give you a sampling of the multiple kinds of contexts that I found myself in and the kinds of realizations that I've had along the way. And honestly, it's such an honor to be able to chat with you, Char, about this, and also sort of, another opportunity for me to reflect on what is now collectively 15 years of lawyering in this area.
Thanks, Arpi, and welcome again. And thank you, Bluestockings, for having us here. It's really a beautiful space because it also brings back the question of land, community, and how spaces are created. And firstly, my immediate reflections of the book is that it's incredibly embodied in your journey. There are different forms of books that lawyers write, and there is a certain speaking and centering of people's voices, which I find extremely evocative in your book. And I think as an organizer, as an artist, I think it speaks on multiple levels. And I also wanted to state that the Forest Rights Act is a very interesting piece of legislation, as all laws tend to codify relations and relationships to the environment and within people. One fact that the Forest Rights Act recognizes this historic injustice in its very preamble is saying a lot about what Adivasis, that translates to the original people in India, have been, in a way, relating to the forest for decades. As one of the Adivasi leaders had said, we were here before the first sunrise. So we're talking about something that goes beyond the existence of the law. But what I really loved about, I think in chapter 2 especially, is about your different forms of state that you're talking about. So I'd love to hear more about how your book speaks to the question of eminent domain on land, because I feel like land consciousness is something that's global in a way, but how your book specifically speaks to that. And it was really gripping for me to look at the different forms of state that you're talking about, and I'd love to hear more about that as a kick-off to the conversation. Let's see where it goes.
Yeah, I think that the learning about the state again happened in the field. I had a very naive understanding of the state that I had inherited both in my legal education and even as a citizen. But I think what I go back to is one of the Adivasi activists said this, and I think that it captures things so beautifully. He said, the politics of the surface and the subterranean, right? The politics of the up and the politics of the down, the politics of the upward mobility and the politics of marginalization. He said all of it can easily go back to one specific legal principle, which divides the surface level property and the subterranean. So he said our entire reality on the surface is delegitimized if the subterranean has hold. So he says we're living on borrowed time in some sense. And that particular legal principle is a different way to re-examine this idea of eminent domain, right? So the legal concept of eminent domain, which says that the state has the right to alienate private ownership once the owner has been compensated, takes a completely different shape in indigenous territories, especially in India, because it says that the surface land is contingent on when the state decides to access the subterranean. And so he also said something, that was one of the most pioneering Adivasi movements in India, which managed to recognize the principle of free, prior and informed consent. And so Lado Sikaka would always say that it's also politics which is temporal. He said that, I don't know when the state is going to come in as like its avatar of authoritarianism, extraction and the police state. And he likened the state in some sense as like the Indian, Rakshas or the Ravana, who has 10 faces, right? And so he's like, the state can access any of those ideas and faces and tap into those legal regimes specifically. And he spoke about the agility and flexibility the state enjoys in terms of the range of decision making. That the politics of the subterranean, again, is also the politics of not just capitalism and extraction, but subversion. And so he would talk about how can I subvert the state? How can I flip that politics of the subterranean? And so that was like a huge learning. That the state is, of course there have been theorists who said it's not a black mark. It is multiple contexts and politics and ideas, but from the Adivasi perspective, it is the politics of the surface and the subterranean.
I think that's a really interesting way of seeing this, and also the movements that are organizing around the subterranean. And just to reiterate, my work has been organizing mainly in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh and in the leadership of Adivasi Vedika and different sangams, as they say, collectives that are organizing for the forest, but also Dalit collectives and also small and marginal farmers. So just want to acknowledge that as I'm here, not representing but talking with. At the same time, I think it's beautiful because one of the Adivasi leaders had spoken something so deep about how had compared the Adivasi governance to a tree where the roots are deep and it's ancestral and it's sacred. The bark is our governance systems which have existed beyond laws, where you're governing your territory, and the branches and the fruits are really the culture. That as the state can keep chopping off the tree, but the resurgence will be from the roots. And I think your book speaks so beautifully about the Niyamgiri struggle and about, for the first time, I mean, it was a historic judgment when the sacredness was recognized as a community right. You know, that your right to preserve your sacredness as part of the struggle, which I think was, which I know that it had repercussions for even our organizing, because you know, communities, and we were then asserting the sacredness, asserting the subterranean, asserting the ancestral burial sites, and asserting that our relationships with the land is not peripheral, it's way deeper than what you can think about. So if you want to speak to that aspect of the law and what it meant as a lawyer to work with something so ephemeral in a way, right?
Yeah, as lawyers, it was something hard for me to come around, despite being one of those lawyers who's a little bit more malleable to that kind of critical legal thinking. I was still sort of schooled in the Western perspective of property rights, right? So there was always this notion of not just eminent domain, subterranean, but this idea that land is something that can be acquired, possessed, and dispossessed. It was almost a transactional parcel that could be exchanged for something, right? That's kind of the basis on which we've learned the law. And then you get this particular new framework that completely subverts any of those conceptions. Because it talks about not just a sacred commitment to the land, but that the sacred commitment is a part of their culture, a part of their embodied experience. How can the law even understand or fathom something so complex, but yet the law has to accommodate this worldview, right? So in some sense, this is where, again, you go back to that struggle of law as a tool of resistance or law as the oppressive force. And this was an interesting moment where I saw that the law can also repair, that the law can also expand and become more malleable. And so I think my biggest learning with the Niyamgiri case was that there is something powerful in recognizing religious rights as the basis for conservation, despite the current political climate we're in India, it's shaky ground. But from the Adivasi perspective, the fact that you have a sacred contract with the land, and that becomes an essential part of how you own and steward the lands, and it further cements your notions of sovereignty, was sort of the linkages which I felt was not just made so boldly in that judgment, but made boldly even in the kinds of evidence that was submitted. The law had to encounter photographs, archival evidence, testimony, where it was just about the sacred, and let it deal with it, you know?
I think it was an incredible strategy because you can't rehabilitate the sacred. You know, there was something about, because most of the land acquisition is about displacement and rehabilitation, and there's something that you couldn't do, you can't move the sacred. You couldn't move those sites, and I think that was one extremely powerful recognition. I also wanted to ask you about the law itself, right? So there are two things. I mean, there's Forest Rights Act, and I think the PISA Act is one of the most powerful elements of governance. And there was a particular judgment called the Samta judgment, which for the first time in India you have scheduled areas, and like in the Schedule 5 areas, the state, right, was then seen as a non-Adivasi. So there is the externalization of the state. You had movements for territorial control. And just to share that, when the forest rights came out, for us, of course, the idea of rules and translation of that, but community forest rights was something that was not recognized. And I still remember that when we were doing the community forest rights mapping, it was about walking from walking on the boundary of the village, which itself was extremely difficult for us because it was 40 kilometers of walking and mapping, right? Because the village in the center of the community forest rights will be accessing resources horizontally, not peripherally. So there are so many ways in which the law is one thing on paper, it's one thing in the courts. As K.G. Kanaguri would say, the court is where you use the law to protest. The law has a different implication in the forest, it has a different implication in life. So as a lawyer, and of course your book speaks a bit to that too, what are your reflections on how is the law translating in these various scenarios? And you've also cited examples of where people are using it differently than how a lawyer would. So if you want to talk to that.
Yeah, I think that you summarized that really well because the law kind of has multiple meanings and multiple perspectives, and the law also loves to categorize, right? The law loves to say who belongs and who doesn't, who has a right and who doesn't. I think it's by its very configuration, it seeks to constrain, and its natural instinct is not to expand and include. It's more about trying to create more barriers for entry. And the Forest Rights Act, what's interesting about it is it's a very bottom-heavy legislation, which means that the communities have to implement it. Communities have to interpret it. That was criticized by a lot of legal scholars because they said, in your effort to democratize the law, you're shifting the burden of legal interpretation and work onto communities who are already marginalized. But what I kind of witnessed was the opposite. That because it was such a bottom-heavy piece of legislation, communities were seeking to use it as a site to infuse the law with their own ideas of belonging, their own ideas of evidence. So even the community mapping exercise that you talk about, as difficult as it was, what was fascinating was I would submit these forest rights claims based on community maps drawn on chart paper, which then went into a process of being made into hard evidence where GPS mapping was placed onto it. And so it was a very interesting space for me to see the sort of informality or the jurisprudence from below or subversive legal interpretations from below being formalized. So there was a churn that was happening. And a lot was being excluded in that translation, right? Or a lot was being asked from the community as well. So one of the interesting encounters I had in Sarista was when the Niyamgiri judgment happened, there was a huge push to use the sacred as a legal strategy. So they started reasserting what were their ancient sacred grounds, and that was such an interesting process because you had to go into the archives, come back to the land, in certain instances even creating sacred sites. So there was a sense of manufacturing legal evidence in order to assert sovereignty. And I think when, I don't want to sort of take away from the violence of these contexts, it is a very violent context, but I want to definitely speak about the scrappiness and the cleverness of these legal strategies, right? So Char spoke a bit about individual forest rights and community forest rights. In one of my chapters, I talk about how, because the law loves to categorize, it restricts land rights to those who've considered indigenous within constitutional law. Those who are not considered indigenous, you got to deal with it. There's nothing that's going to happen. You have to provide evidence that you've been living there for 75 years. So there was a village which was a mixed village. There was part of the community which was indigenous, the other part was lower caste. So they did this really clever thing where they said, let's apply for community forest rights. We will divvy up the land how we want to. Let's not even get the state involved. And just witnessing that, I was like, this is such a smart way to work the law. So they were able to do that kind of legal mechanics, so to speak. But yeah, I think the law in some sense I've come to realize is like it's an uneasy coexistence with these multiple laws and multiple meanings, but as long as you're able to use it to belong on your own terms, why not?
Yeah, I think definitely there were so many creative strategies that we as activists could use with the forest rights and PISA. For instance, even when we were doing the community map, it was intergenerational. So it's already transfer of what it means, what our boundaries are to the next generation. So it was part of the strategy. But also, in many villages, there was a campaign to just mark the territory despite the state's recognition. Because it was almost saying that the law says that we have our rights to the community boundaries, so let's go mark it. So they were like, you would pick the rock, you would pick the sacred site and say this belongs to this village and this is our community territory. Because I think that was the most difficult legal aspect to claim to. And then the other strategy, which I'd love you to speak more about, is this idea of mixed communities, right? And of course, you have Dalit communities, you have OBCs, and this is something that the state continues to categorize people as in definitions and many so colonial definitions of the way the state sees its own citizenship. But coming back to how the Dalit Mahila Sangam in Kalahasti, Chittoor, which is in South India, organized for grazing rights and rights to the forest by just printing the Forest Rights Act, and if the Forest Department, which is a British colonial department that was set up, would stop them, would just present the right and be like, we have rights to graze, right? So it was like using the law, but using it in your own terms. And but then you also raise a very important question about the Dalits' struggle and the struggle for environmental justice as an anti-caste movement too, which I think is something that your book covers in a whole chapter. So would love to hear you speak to that in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, that idea of like just presenting a piece of legislation as a way to negotiate with the state was something I've seen happen a lot, right? I think like when I was in law school, a lot of the human rights law scholarship was always very critical of the law. It was always sort of like the law is a force of oppression. There's only so much it can do. But you really understand the power of the mere existence of these pieces of legislation when you see that kind of negotiation happen on the ground and how it recrafts power on the ground. But coming to the idea of the Forest Rights Act as a way in which it excludes Dalit or the formerly known untouchables, was that it was a bit of a realization for me too. And I think that's because I'm higher caste, I'm a Brahmin. So as a Brahmin lawyer going into these contexts, and it was interesting, the story of environmentalism was always a story of Adivasi communities, fish workers. It was never seen through a caste lens. Or rather, it was sort of, it existed but we didn't pay attention to it. That's a better way to frame it. And when I was in Sariska, where they were creating these sacred areas, I happened to go into one of them. And a little boy behind me was trying to go in. And the Gujar community leader who was with me, he told the boy, don't come. So I said, why are you stopping him from coming? And he said, he's a Dalit, he can't enter this place. So I said, even the sacred is configured and sort of coded within the caste system, even in forest areas. So that threw open an entire sort of arena of both lawyering and looking at the law that I had to sort of reckon with. And my realization has been that environmentalism in India has largely been Brahminical, to the extent where land rights, untouchability, all of which is contingent on the basis of access to resources, but never formed a central piece of both the politics or the imaginary of environmental justice until now. now there's a lot of work emerging in that space. And just to speak a bit to the Forest Rights Act itself, because it goes back to the point I was making earlier that communities have to provide evidence that they've been living and depending on these forests for 75 years to be able to access land rights. Dalit communities have been historically landless. So here was one and they retreated to the forest to escape the violence of the plains. And so they said, okay, this might be a chance to actually gain access to land rights. But the law refused to do that. And providing evidence showing that you've been living and depending on these lands for 75 years is a real difficult task. So by design, I think that the FRA was not a well thought out anti-caste piece of legislation. However, communities are doing the hard work of creative legal interpretation to have the other communities benefit from the law, but not happening at the level of the state, lawyering or thinking around it.
I think you raise an extremely important point in that chapter because it's also how the state has constantly used these kind of divisive techniques, whether it's recruiting from the Adivasi community to the forest department or the police, or pitching communities against each other, pitching the Dalit community against the Adivasi community, or in Telangana, for instance, deliberately building the political power of the Lambada community who have a ST status in certain, in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, and have a denotified status in Karnataka. So breaking the unity within the community, but also pitching them against the Chenchus, deliberately settling communities in Adivasi areas. This was, in the time of the British, there was something like 800 nomadic communities. And all of these, the attempt was always to settle, because the idea of settling means also the idea of controlling. And most of these they were forcefully settled as villages in forests. So there's been and you're absolutely right that whether it's lawyering, activism, it's always a very Brahminical view of the forest, right? And there is a certain purity, which is a very caste system, which entity of purity that comes with the purity of legislation, but also the purity of forests, right? So the environment is always, and this is a very old debate, of course, that the environment is seen as this beautiful, Lion King version of just talking animals and birds and flowers with no human relationship whatsoever. But we see the resurgence of that purity-ridden notion of the environment emerge again and again, whether it was wildlife first, fighting against the Forest Rights Act, whether it's Red and Red Plus, where acres of forests are just becoming, inviolate of human access. So if you would want to talk to that aspect, I know this is an old debate, but it keeps coming back in all of the issues that we're dealing with, is these inviolate purity in these spaces.
That's a tough question. Despite it being an old debate, it's interesting how it resurfaces over and over again. It's like, those, I don't know if there used to be this video game when I was growing up. I don't know if others played this, or it was something that my mother forced me to play. It was basically you kill the zombie comes back in new form. So the enemy kind of keeps taking a new life. And I think that this debate is far from settled, right? There is this idea that we have now reached a space where environmentalism has evolved for it to understand that human interaction and human rights is an integral part of it. I don't think so. I think that struggle continues, and I'm happy to speak a bit more to that. But going back to your question of Red Plus and what's happening, I think the way I've witnessed lawyering in forest areas, or the way I've sort of seen genres of lawyering, is that the law has tried to, on the one hand, prevent any kind of extraction or any kind of harm by recognizing Adivasi sovereignty, right? It's like the perfect dovetailing of human rights with the rights of the forest and rights of nature, And so there is pressure on the Adivasi community to conserve these areas. So that's kind of one preventative strategy. But essentially a large part of the law is operating in the post-harm scenario or the compensatory scenario. The idea is we can like do the damage now, we'll figure it out later. So as much as we go with this notion of the pristine environment, it's pristine with the idea that it can be extracted from later. It's conservation with the possibility to damage later, right? So it's never this notion, it's almost like you're creating a bank that you're going to go back to. It's like a savings. And this compensatory approach we're seeing across the board with climate crisis, with biodiversity crisis. It's all about let's figure out what capitalism needs to survive and duplicate. We can discipline it later. It's a later problem. Whereas what we actually need is a preventative framework, right? And a preventative framework that's just, not a preventative framework that continues to exclude communities who probably have more wisdom in terms of shaping societies that are formed on that. And the other idea is also what's intrinsically built into the law is when nature is pristine, the state is possibly the only institutional face worth protecting or that is capable of protecting those spaces. And indigenous capacity to protect those landscapes is seen through the lens of harm. Your right to grazing is fully criminalized. Your right to use minor forest produce is criminalized. My right to mine coal is recognized. So my next book, I'm already in the next book phase, is looking at this very idea of extractive legality. How is the law coded extraction and how is the state benefited from it?
No, I think it's an extremely important point because I also feel that when you look at the way these pristine environments work, it's also there's the creation of empathy to the tiger that does not voice its own rights in a way, and the creation of these sanctuaries of inviolate spaces is a way in which you criminalize relationships of communities to the forest. And through that criminalization, you're criminalizing an entire community, right? So rather than directly saying, leave the forest, we're displacing you, the strategy was that we are criminalizing the way you're using the forest, the way the tigers, the population of tigers, the reduction had to do a lot with the hunting during the colonial era too, but no one looks into that. And going back to where we were organizing in Telangana and in the Chenchu areas, all of these tiger sanctuaries later became tourist spots. So the extraction is not just in the form of land, but in the form of this tourism. And in fact, at one point, De Beers was looking at diamond mining in a sanctuary wildlife protected area where people were already displaced. So the intention was never about actual conservation, and I think there was a study that spoke about like 20 plus sanctuaries that were already going into this kind of extractive framework, which seemed to be the original intent anyway. I'm going to have an open-ended point. Is there anything about the book that you wanted to talk about? I know that there's a scope within the book, but the Forest Rights Act, or whether it's PISA, is also a result, and the environmental laws in India is also a result of various forces globally. But I want to keep that open-ended. Is there anything that you want to speak that was not mentioned in the book, but you felt that the book is kind of alluding to?
Thank you. I think I want to sort of use the time to talk about my favorite part of the book. So one of the interesting encounters that I had when I was researching in what was a bauxite mine, an iron ore mine, and a coal mine, because I wanted to compare the political economy of each of these metals to see how it influences or pushes away progressive legal interpretation and recognition of indigenous sovereignty. And I encountered these brokers who identified as dalals. And they were sort of the intermediaries between the mining company and the local indigenous community. And they operated as legal interpreters in a very fascinating way. So they would go to the local community and they would say, I completely understand that you're looking to recognize your sovereignty, but you do realize that this is what the law says. And there's only so much you can do with your own legal activism, right? Because these are communities who don't have access to legal aid. And so it was a strange situation where I was stuck with one of these dalals driving back to the main city where I was staying for my field work, and it was a 4-hour car ride. By far the most uncomfortable yet interesting car ride I've ever been in, where he starts telling me about how he came into this profession, what are the strategies they use and why they exist. And he would talk about how he was almost like a crafty ethnographer. So he said he would go and live with those communities. He would attend weddings. If they had medical bills that needed paying, he would pay them. So he would be the face of the company doing good when the state was absent. And so it created this strange relationship of dependency and trust. And from there, extractive legal interpretations also emerged. So he would divide the community slowly, where he would say, okay, this family has agreed to sell their land for so much, and where he's settling down here. Are you interested? So these brokers, the reason I wanted to come back to this is because we always look at the climate crisis in a very macro sense, right? We talk about it, we always say the youth climate activists specifically will say, it's not climate change, we want systems change. But you really realize, you kind of notice the micro politics of these global systems in these corners. And you need to get into those microscopic, granular conversations to change the system. I think that there's this notion that if we change the way global capitalism works, that all of the climate crisis can be resolved. But rather because we're operating, whether it's our democracies and the ongoing climate in terms of both the ongoing war as well as other things, we're all kind of operating in a post-harm scenario, where harm is seen as the language through which we operate. And we need relational repair to happen in those micro contexts to have macro impact. So I feel that's sort of, I'm hoping, is the lesson that the book shares, and it's a lesson that I learned the hard way by working with Arpitha communities. Saying that yes, you are fighting the mighty forces. You need to do it from a certain grounded basis. And that it's okay to have small impact. And you need to puncture the system as opposed to change the system, right? Because if you start to talk about incremental change among climate activists, there's a sense of like a very unsexy feeling, right? What do you mean by incrementally? There's a certain politics of doing it. But rather it's not. It's the hard work of making those relational micro-level changes that we need to see. And I think the law also operates like that. So we need lesser dalals in that sense.
No, I completely agree that it's these micro changes and like sites of sovereignty that we have to recreate and redo, and also learn to circuit and attempt to circuit, and then it becomes a force, right? And it really reminds me what you said about Few is an indigenous leader from the Samoa Islands, and he had come to Telangana and was staying with us in communities. And he said this, he said, as indigenous people, like, we do not focus on the enemy. While we keep focusing on the sovereignty, automatically are challenging the enemy, right? So the struggle, the strategies of struggle, rather, is more pronged than that. And that if you know, like, we know where we come from, we know who we are, and therefore we know where we are going. So that the fact that these, whether it's legal strategies or struggle, comes from a very embodied sense of belonging and relationality. And I think that and for me, like, the consciousness of land, our relationship with this very material basis of land is something that is constantly being removed from our senses of being. Whether it's whether it's the food we eat, the conversation we're having today, everything has to do with the material basis. But our relationship to it is so far alienated. But at least here, like it's, if we're talking about the context where we're in, the idea of like taking over public space, community gardens, whatever that is not a sense of leisure, but rather like continuing to build that consciousness. I think it's those relationships which are being criminalized, relationships that are being alienated, and then how do we, in our micro level, continue to like consciously build those, which I think is really important. And your book, in a way, is contextualizing that, because you are talking about centering people and decentering the pro-business state. You say that beautifully. I also want to be aware of time. How are we on time?
It's 6:55.
6:55. Okay, so do we open it up for questions, just discussions, conversations? Is there anything else you want to do? It's going to be that first person.
So I have a quick question about what is the legal reform and what the forward-looking message of the book is. So in terms of maybe legislative design, in terms of how we think about changing people's minds about how they see this problem and sort of locating your response within the kind of state that we have in India now, what are the kinds of messages that you want the reader to be able to take?
Right, I think that, thank you for asking that question. So in terms of the idea of where will the law go from here, I draw a lot from that creative legal imagination that Adivasi communities have been so fervent about. And I'm going to start with the temporal aspect of it and then go into sort of detailing some of the technical aspects of it. So in terms of the temporality, they talk about slowness. So the current state that we have in India, a lot of the environmental law amendments have been made under the guise of ease of doing business and speed, right? It's how quick can we make these decisions? How quick can we alienate these communities to be able to provide the land? How can we cleverly maneuver these systems? There's the bureaucratic burden, right? And I think that's something we're seeing across multiple authoritarian states. It's about the minimum state, maximum governance and efficiency. So there is a temporal aspect where they say we need to slow down. These are big decisions that we're making. You can't make these decisions quickly because not only are we talking about alienating communities from the land, we're talking about ecological impact that we can't even fathom. There was in terms of speaking about that temporality and that sense of slowness, one of the communities that I've assisted legally to push back against a steel giant was not successful, and the land was going to be acquired. So a day before the land was going to be acquired, we had a mourning ceremony, a ceremony where we just mourned the loss of land. And so they talked about the emotive aspect. So one is the temporal, the second is the relational and the emotive aspect, where we need to reinsert ourselves in relation to that materiality and see what that means. So from that kind of ethos, the legal design that they talk about is very much akin to the ideas of direct democracy. So if we have to slow down these decisions, then we need to talk about it a lot more. So it's sort of a deliberative circuit that they talk about. They say first we need to sit down and see what are you actually talking about. What does it mean in terms of the land, the water, and the trees, and for us? Okay, so then you kind of have to have a conversation of this is the extractive decision, this is the decision that's least harmful. They're also pragmatic with their politics. They say if you slow down, you'll also be able to see these issues more carefully. And the last part of it is consent, where they say that, okay, if this is how we're going to do this, then this is the basis on which this will happen. they realized that the entire force of the preventative aspect of environmental law will never be realized, because in some ways there is a sense of giving in to the forces that we, especially now at the current state, because the criminal legal system is being fully weaponized against them. So they're not able to fully protest like they used to. So they are like in the situation where they're saying, what is the least degree of harm? And how slow can we make that decision? And so that's sort of the legal design aspect that the book is also talking about. And what happens if environmental law slows down? What if it's not good?
Questions? Why do you think you want to share, Adam? I know there are also folks in the audience who are working on some of that.
Good question. Could you speak more? So you touched on this a bit about connecting to the global climate justice movement, and it's so interesting when you talk about subterranean and subversive, and how you see that also play out in the international scheme now, especially with climate justice. You touched on a little bit. If you could talk a bit more about your thoughts on that, what you're seeing, because you've been working with international community organizers, or with international organizers, and now local level organizers at national level, state. You have so much perspective from different parts of society, of government, what you're seeing that connection is happening.
So I think there are two parts to that response, right? Like on the one hand, I think working at that micro level becomes really important to see the very face of extraction, to see sort of how does capitalism operate and how is it violent, what does it mean, right? And the lessons one can learn about resistance from there. I think the part that I find lacking among the international climate justice activists is not being able to see that microscopic lens of how these decisions impact. So that's where I feel like there's a need for bridge building to happen, right? Like a lot of the older environmental justice movements have to in some ways extend and reach out to the climate justice movements and vice versa. And I initially thought that I was creating that narrative in my mind, that there wasn't conversation happening across the board. But at least in India, I can speak about this specifically to India, there is a complete separation of these movements, right? So, but what's happening now is climate is giving older environmental justice movements a newer and more radical framing in some senses. So while there isn't a conversation happening, there's a sense that a lot of the older legal struggles are being climatized as well. So especially indigenous sovereignty or Adivasi sovereignty. So one of the communities I'll be going to field work with in December, they're protesting a coal mine under the guise of climate justice, right? So that's such an interesting meeting point of that, inherent granular politics with the macro global politics. And so that's where I see a lot of the future going in terms of those kinds of movements and that kind of politics, where it's ground up literally. But not to take away from the hard work being done by climate justice activists at all. Like they are fighting the good fight, especially around loss and damage. You would know that a lot better than I do, and climate reparations. But I think that there is something there in terms of going back to indigenous struggles, going back to the anti-nuclear struggles and saying, okay, how do we connect the dots?
I was wondering, what kind of cooperation or solidarity exists between the different communities and their individualized struggles across each other, and if they do solidarity actions together. Was that clear?
I can hear you.
I
can
can hear you.
repeat the question.
Oh, I can repeat myself.
Yeah, sure.
I was just wondering what kind of solidarity, action, or cooperation exists between the different communities and their individualized struggle, and whether they have collaboration, if they show up for each other, and if there's some sort of
There definitely is. There's a very, very strong umbrella of movement called many actually. I don't even want to sort of label them. But there's solidarity that happens at the level of the state and at the federal level as well. So the law that we were talking about, both the Panchayat extension of scheduled areas, PESA, as well as FRA, came through those umbrella movements. And so the movement that I got to sort of interact with a lot was called the Campaign for Survival and Dignity, which brought together a lot of indigenous movements. And then the Vistatik Virodhsang, which is a movement that's protesting relocation and dispossession. And what's fascinating in those contexts is how solidarity, the mechanics of solidarity. So if one particular community in a rural area in southern Orissa was threatened with dispossession under a certain basis, immediately on the WhatsApp group, someone will say, this is the strategy that we used and this is what we did. This is the way in which you can plan the action. But be careful, this is how the police will react. So it's very, very clever, it's very quick, and there is a lot of network sort of solidarity on the ground. But there are divisions as well. So solidarity also is fragmented, I want to say, in at least the state that I did work in, which is Orissa, where again the Dalit community could not work with the Adivasi community in certain instances, but they would come together on certain issues as well. So it was, I want to say, strategic alliance building and not like true solidarity in that sense, but it was more of like strength in numbers where we come together. But we have different belief systems and that's okay. But we still see each other as, I used to love being in those rooms and seeing those dialogues play out so respectfully. They couldn't see eye to eye on the issue of land rights, but they would come together when it came to the rising authoritarianism.
Yeah, I think to respond to your question on two levels, when we're talking about Adivasis or indigenous people, though the term in India doesn't hold value, I see it in phases. Till 2000, from 2000, at least in my lived experience, like from 2000 to 2012, and then 12 to 2018 were like extremely important international movements of indigenous people talking about this, climate justice, talking about land rights, and also with the articulation of, the rights of Mother Earth, which was this concept of living well, where you saw, forces of nature also having rights, as we're all living forms in relation. In fact, there were like forums that we were part of, which was the Indigenous Peoples Climate Change Assessment, which was where Indigenous people were like, we don't want to be double refugees of the climate change. Institutions where trees were being planted in the forest, when you had an international corporation mining elsewhere, but planting trees in another region, where then you had forces coming together and we're doing an anti-mining, but we're also doing an anti-planting kind of campaign. So this was happening, but I also feel there was a deliberate move to kind of also silence, but also stop these international interactions and national movements. Definitely the Forest Rights Act wasn't gifted to the citizenship, it was a struggle. It was an eviction order, and it was a result of an eviction order where thousands of Adivasis came together and said, we will not be moved, right? So that's one. When we talk about I can only speak about the Indian context, where the fabric of the society is largely a caste system. I mean, I would say it's primarily a caste system based fabrication, and it's what's informing social relationships, and that is also linked to resources and land. So one of the organizing bases for us in Telangana and Andhra Pradesh was how do we look at Adivasis, Dalits, small and marginal farmers, what we call co-producers, who were working class, who were in the city, not accessing land, but were largely dependent on food. And then food sovereignty became an issue of coming together. Because food is another way in which you are relating very consciously with the land, right? And you're both producing and consuming. So that became a point of coming together where even Adivasis were talking about, though we have our individual forest rights, Monsanto controls what we grow. Therefore, do we really control our land? If we do not control how we use our land, do we genuinely control our rights to land? So then food became a forum where we all came together. There was a criminalization of people's livelihoods with the whole fascism looking at criminalization of beef. So then that became a move where you come together. So I think solidarity has to be definitely it's issue-based at points, and those are those forms of solidarity where you come together on an issue and then you disperse. But if you really want to build a material base of solidarity, it has to be somewhere linked to the idea of land. I mean, this is something I strongly believe, because that's the one basis that you have 1% very consciously controlling. It's the one thing that you're still selling to pay the dowry of your daughter's marriage. It's the one thing you're selling to for your education, but without realizing that it's one of the most important material bases. That today, if we have to live in a stateless point, if we're able to grow our own food, it's one step towards a sovereign way of being. So that became, and it's a very, and in my experience, it's a powerful way of coming together.
Thinking and reflecting on what you've been saying, I've kind of, and from a law and policy perspective, by the way, Professor Bruce is hello, but I think about a lot how law and policy is so contingent on science and probability, and when we're talking about traditional knowledge, I'm just wondering if you could speak more on how we can make space for that law and policy, and more like, I think law and policy is also so reliant on this metabolic risk that we don't have a attachment and understanding to nature, that we're so above it or separate that we can't control it, where traditional knowledge is a whole opposition to that perspective. So how can you kind of consider those traditional views when making law and policy, especially on an international level?
Yeah, I think that's a really challenging area for the law. And one of the lessons I've learned working with Adivasi communities is they think of the law as a bit of a stubborn friend, right? It takes really long to convince the law. You just have to kind of be active. And so they've had small wins along the way. And so maybe I can speak to that as potential ways for us to think about how can the law understand or base decisions on traditional knowledge. So the one thing that they did during the drafting of the Forest Rights Act, in order to make room for that, is when they were crafting the rules around legal evidence, they kept it very open-ended. And one of the rules actually mentions testimony of an elder as a basis of legal evidence. And a lot of communities use that as the space to document traditional knowledge, to actually create community-based conservation plans. And it took a really long time to get there, right? Because a lot of environmental law, for some reason, thinks that hard science and expertise is going to save the day. Even the evolution of climate law is going in that direction, especially when attribution science and climate modeling is so inaccessible and so expensive, that sometimes you need to look at citizen science and traditional knowledge as the more accessible pockets. And so I think the onus is on us, actually, to craft legal strategies or to work with communities who have ideas to expand the law to include those conceptions. That doesn't mean we do away with the battle of whether this is evidence enough for the law, right, around traditional knowledge, or it goes into the realm of intellectual property rights, where it becomes an entire exercise of protecting commercialization of traditional knowledge, but not looking at it as a basis for conservation. So I think that's something I might look towards as a possible way to address that.
And maybe this is beyond the scope of the conversation, but I was thinking of land masses or water masses that don't necessarily have a population living within it or by it. I'm thinking specifically, I'm thinking of the Calafia Bay in Andaman and Nicobar Islands, where no one lives in those islands, and the government is building the international container terminal, which again doesn't affect the direct livelihoods of anyone living there because no one does. But what might happen is it'll obviously come down to affect the livelihoods of, say, the fishermen who are living 3 islands away. So I wonder what the legality around those land masses and water masses is.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And I think that we've been seeing interesting movements globally around the rights of nature and the idea that nature has agency in the law. And again, not to say that it's new, right? We've always had biodiversity law that does that. So that can be one way to conceptualize the legality of those landscapes. It becomes harder because it's much easier to lawyer when you have a sustained social movement and human interests are deeply tied into that. When it's just nature defending itself, then it unfortunately, at least in the Indian context, it takes the elite ecologist to step in.
Yeah. And especially the example I gave, the leatherback turtle scientists who have probably never stepped foot in the island are the ones who are becoming the spokesperson of these stuff.
And so that becomes another question of what are we doing to environmentalism in an effort to protect these areas.
But before I wrap up, I actually want to know if anyone in the audience, because I was curious to understand the history of protected areas in the United States. So I was wondering if anyone wanted to speak to that. But if not, we can wrap up. I know that there's a longer history here, but there are so many of these inviolate spaces here of protected areas. So wondering if anyone in the audience. Just trying to understand the history of protected areas here. When you have national parks, was that a conservation move? Was it a land amassment move?
It's an awesome move to give people a place to relax. A lot of protected places, like Boston Park. I like to go to Boston Park because it's a cool picture. They probably saw that and they tried to put effort to bring it there. A lot of effort to making it, so it's going to take a lot of effort to go away. So, and it's just conserving whatever we have left. This place here, library, so
Thanks for sharing. Did you want to?
Yeah, I think a lot of it came out of conservation ethics in the early 20th century, but there's different tiers of federal lands too, and so we do have federal lands that I think are essentially, depending on who's in charge, basis of extraction as well. So the national parks, you cannot do extraction of them, but a lot of the federal forests are federal lands. We're going to have a new president who is going to be expanded
Right. So, firstly, I want to thank Arpitha. Congratulations. I mean, it's a great work. Also, the fact that you held the space, that you held it as a conversation space, that you want, as your book very clearly speaks to organizers. I think the fact that we're here gathered in this community space is something that we can lead on, and it's incredible. And I'm really, really happy to be in this space with you. And yeah, and thanks for everyone who's here. Your book was very inspiring. It inspired the artwork. It inspired us being here together. And probably the first of many in New York City. Yeah. Thank you.